Hi, everyone. It's Joseph here with Andrew. We were supposed to be in your feed today with an interview on the whole discussion around Canada, the UK, Australia, Portugal, France, and others recognizing state of Palestine at the UN General Assembly this week. Unfortunately, our interview had to bail at the last minute, hoping to get it rescheduled for some time in mid to late October. And so you'll hear what comes next is Andrew and I will just have our own discussion around this topic. You will hopefully detect in our voices and hopefully in the way that we've come at it that yes, we do have our own perspective. It's one, frankly, that we share, but we are attempting to talk about this in ways that hopefully will resonate with you and in ways in which we do try and entertain different perspectives despite our own very clear view on this. And so with that, let's get into it. Just to get everyone caught up, what of course happened this week is at the UN General Assembly, Prime Minister Carney came out and officially recognized the state of Palestine. He joined many, Britain, France, Portugal, Australia. And for me, this is a very interesting issue because it represents a significant change in both the rhetoric and the position that Canada's taken on this specific issue. I thought before Andrew and I get into the conversation, we'll play two clips. I want to play just a very short clip of my former boss, Foreign Minister John Baird, speaking to Canada's support of Israel. And we're going to compare that to the statements that the PM had to say this week at UNGA, and then we'll just try and make sense of it as best as we can.
Just as fascism and communism were the great struggles of previous generations, terrorism is the great struggle of ours. And far too often, the Jewish state is on the front line in our struggle, and its people are the victims of terror. Canada will not accept or stay silent while the Jewish state is attacked for defending its territory and its citizens.
So that is John Baird speaking about the degree to which Canada was always going to stand, not behind Israel, but stand shoulder to shoulder with it. And certainly was a position that drew a lot of attention when we were in government. And I'd like to contrast that with what Carney had to say this week.
Israeli government is working methodically to prevent the prospect of a Palestinian state from ever being established. And
tirelessly continues settlement expansion in the West Bank. That is illegal under international law. Its constant aggression against Gaza has claimed the lives of tens of thousands of civilians. It has compelled the displacement of more than 2 million people.
So there we are. I mean, it is a pretty strong contrast, I find, obviously between the two governments of that time. I'm going to disclose this up front right now. You're going to hear a bit of hesitation in my voice. You may hear it in Andrew's. It is because this is, quite frankly, an issue that is quite personal to me. It is one I care deeply about for a bunch of reasons. But we'll note that up front and try and make sense of it. So, Andrew, what was your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, look, same as you. I feel obviously very deeply connected to the state of Israel, to Judaism. And this is, for me, we've kind of crossed a red line. So since the Oslo Accords, the line of every Western government, pretty much, certainly in the Anglosphere, has always been two-state solution, which is one I personally support, but can only ever come as a consequence of negotiation on both sides, and as part of a long-term peace. I mean, so to pretend, as like Keir Starmer did, that this is some kind of way of helping the peace process along, when you give one side everything they've asked for and the other you kind of box into a corner and do it against their wishes. I just thought this was completely and utterly bizarre. And also to hear Carney's language about, I think, what did he say about Israel's aggression or something against Gaza? Well, let's just remember the context of why there's a war in Gaza. It's like saying, in World War II, Well, look, the Allies' aggression against the Nazis, right, in which, very sadly, lots of German civilians also died because that's the consequence of war, unfortunately, which is why it would be better if we didn't have war. To say, well, the Allies' constant aggression against Germany is causing all sorts of... I just think it's an astounding language to use. And, one clip, I put something up on LinkedIn earlier this week, which was Margaret Thatcher speaking in a conference, I think in 1989, 1990, where she talked about anybody who takes hostages is automatically excluded from the international community, and that, you can't be part of the civilized world and support terrorism. And the reality of this is, and there's a different perspective, which I will put in a moment, because we do try to be fair on this, but, when the people who are holding the hostages are praising Western leaders for a decision, you might want to think about whether or not the thing you have done is really helping the peace process. I mean, come on, this is nonsense. It's also like, recognizing a state that, it's all this recognition stuff doesn't actually mean anything. The state doesn't exist, right? Because it can only ever exist through a negotiated process, because it hasn't got all of the functioning things that are required of a state, which primarily is the recognition by Israel, right? And agreed borders and all the rest of it. So I just was left really, really kind of open mouthed by the idea that you push Israel away, despite the fact. Let's remember what happened on October the 7th. Hamas are praising you, and apparently you think this is going to help peace. I just find it completely astounding.
Yeah. I also wonder why the West, why Canada and others would give up any negotiating leverage. I have been steadfast supporter of a two-state solution. I've been a steadfast supporter of a negotiated two-state solution, because you need that negotiation to establish terms that are going to allow a future Palestinian state to be successful. You need defined borders of some kind. You also need political leadership. You need political leadership that has a chance of being successful, and the options right now are non-existent. The Palestinian Authority has proven over the course of decades to be highly ineffective as a political leader of any kind. So we don't have the conditions required to actually have a successful state, because we need, if it's going to be successful, if peace is going to be successful, you need the two-state solution to actually to take stock. And I don't know why you would reward the behavior of October 7th. And to your point, that is exactly what has occurred here. The reasons why we are dealing with the conflict that we're dealing with in Gaza right now, as horrible as it is because it is a reaction to what occurred on October 7th. And until those hostages are released, I don't understand why you would give Hamas what it's been asking for. And last thing I'll say is Hamas has been clear that it saw recognition of a Palestinian statehood as the fruits of the October 7th attacks.
Yeah. I mean, this is, a reward for rape and butchery and hostage taking. You take hostages, you rape innocent women, and you butcher people in their own homes, and you end up getting the very thing it is that you've been demanding. And, the reason there isn't a Palestinian state, we can go into all the history of that. And, there are certainly, there is a case for the Palestinians to have their own state. Of course, that was what the initial vision was for the region. And, Olmert, when he was prime minister, offered 98% of all the territory of Gaza and the West Bank, a state that was rejected by Palestinians. The Palestinians themselves have to answer their own question. Because what frustrates me as well is it's kind of like we've infantilized, whatever it is, the Palestinians, as if like they're not responsible for anything themselves towards this process. And it's kind of like, it's a little bit patronizing, really, because actually the PLO and the Palestinian Authority also should be held accountable for the things it has done or failed to do, which would have helped bring about this process earlier. And of course, there are failings on the Israeli side. I have no time at all for those members of the Israeli government who are calling for the annexation of the West Bank and all the rest of it, and there are people in the Israeli politics, because it's a vibrant democracy with a ridiculous voting system that allows fringe elements to get elected because of the almost pure PR, proportional representation thing, who are saying crazy things who I want nothing to do with, who clearly don't want a Palestinian state ever to exist, and who don't accept the right of Palestinians to live peacefully in their own country. And I reject that entirely as well. But the Palestinian Authority, let's remember, is still the authority which has got lots of questions to ask about what it's teaching kids in its schools, has, named town squares, sporting events, all sorts, after people who are terrorists who have murdered innocent civilians. So these are not, they are, and now they're being put on this pedestal and being rewarded for what happened after October the 7th. Now, of course, you can argue that Fatah and the Palestinian Authority has said it doesn't approve of what happened on the 7th, but the fact is Hamas are in effective control. Hamas continue to have huge support amongst the Palestinian public in polling, significant support at the very least, perhaps not so much in Gaza now. This is a complete reward for the wrong sort of behavior. And the whole thing just blurs my mind. It's actually hard to put into words. Yeah. Now, that said, there are people who argue, including in Israel, and we need to be, because we have to be always open-minded about this. I did read an interesting article in the Times yesterday, which was Ami Ayalon, who was the former director of Shin Bet. He was saying his take was that this could be useful. This is a nightmare for Hamas. And he took a very different view to this because he thinks it will isolate Hamas within the Palestinian community. I'm not sure I buy that, but this is a quote from him. They said it is a great gift to Hamas. It is not a great gift to Hamas. It is a nightmare for Hamas. It is a collapse of their ideology. They will disappear as a major political player, he told at the Times. So, it is important that we that there are different views on this.
I suppose one way to interpret that would be if this was the big prize that Hamas and others have been fighting for. Now that they have it, now that they have that international recognition, are they able to actually turn around, go from terrorist activity, brutal terrorist activity, to actually now wanting to actually govern and demonstrate that they're able to make the state of Palestine a thriving nation of some kind. Obviously, I'm deeply skeptical about their motives, because I don't think that their motives are exclusively to have a state of Palestine. It is to have a state of Palestine only such that it eradicates the state of Israel. And so then if that is the case, then it's not a two-state solution, because a two-state solution only works if Israelis are recognized as an indigenous population. And so that has to be a reciprocal recognition. And so I think the real test now is to see how serious is Hamas, PLO, Palestinian Authority, how serious are they about now taking the fact that this is what they've been calling for a long time. They have a version of it. Can they actually start to build a civil society?
I mean, this is, I could really espouse and get very angry about this, but I'm trying to be restrained because obviously, it's a podcast and people have different views, and also it's not just for us to push our views. So there are these different opinions. But actually, I think what's really interesting on this one state issue, right, is that, there are clearly voices on the extreme of Israeli politics who don't want a two-state solution. And, there are reasons why, portions of the public don't want that, because they think every time they've taken a measure towards that, it's come back to bite them. The, complete and utter removal of Israelis from Gaza, and the removal of Israel from Gaza in 2005, which was supposed to then offer Gaza the opportunity to show what a Palestinian state could be, resulted in obviously everything that we've seen since, which it becoming nothing other than a launch pad of terrorism. But the reality of it is that many of the people who now advocate for the Palestinian cause don't actually support the right of Israel to exist at all. You see it in this kind of like the way they have besmirched Zionism, right? Which is the belief that Jews have a right to live in their indigenous lands in their own state, right? Which is something which people from the left to the right always supported on the basis of it, in the mainstream. I mean, on the basis of it's just a right to a homeland, whilst also protecting the rights of the Arab population that also lived there. but now Zionism is now being turned into this dirty thing that you're not allowed to be a Zionist. So actually what a lot of these people want is the disestablishment of the state of Israel, right? And you're seeing this, and they want a Palestinian state where, yes, of course, Jews can live, but it's going to be a Palestinian state. And, so the interesting here is, like, there is some suggestion that, these governments, which are all centre-left governments, largely, have particularly in Canada, Australia, and the UK, have done this to placate a political problem they have at home with some of their own voter base, some of their own party. And if that is the case, it's not going to work either, because you see with these activists, as soon as they came out and said, yes, we're declaring a state, like, oh, that's not enough. What are you now going to do on Israel? You've got to boycott Israel. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. So it's actually about, for many of these people, this is a campaign to disestablish the state and delegitimize the state of Israel. And let's just be honest about that, right? That's what it is. And there are many people in the Palestinian cause who want Israel to cease to exist.
Yeah.
And, these people have now just handed them a victory of our leaders. So what the message is, a massive increase in anti-Semitic racism, take to the streets with offensive and appalling placards, whilst, of course, most of the people who go to this process, I'm sure, are peaceful, say the most awful things about Jews and about Israel, and, scream and shout and threaten, and, because MPs have faced all sorts of things from some of these protesters as well, and you'll get your own way.
That to me is also the part that also makes me incredibly sad is the degree to which we've seen a massive rise in hate against Jews in places like Canada, in the UK, and other places like that. I obviously have a great fear that is not going to disappear anytime soon, despite...
No, because let's actually have an honest conversation, right, about this, right? Some of this stuff that's been pumped out to those communities in the UK and in Canada, it's stuff that's, very directly targeted. It's coming from some of our enemies of the West who don't share our values at all. It's been fed members of this community in our countries, and it's a broader problem of Jew hate, right? There is more than just Israel. There is a problem with anti-Semitism, and it is particularly, as we've proven by polling, problem in certain communities in the UK. And, let's just be honest about that, right? That we have a huge problem, which is much bigger than just this issue of Israel versus Palestine, as it were. And, politicians are not being honest about that, right? About this radical extremism that is manifesting itself on our streets and in our politics in a way that we wouldn't tolerate it for other forms of extremism, right? It would be quite rightly, nipped in the bud and very aggressively tackled.
In the interest, again, of making sure we're not completely presenting just our views, let's talk about sort of the political side of this, which is the decisions that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has taken. One way to interpret this is Israel was always going to be held to the most extreme standards on proportionate or disproportionate response to October 7th. And I recall when October 7th happened, my first thought was, fuck, here we go. Israel's going to have to respond. And it doesn't matter what that response looks like. It could be one rocket. It could be a ground invasion. It could be somewhere in between the two. And it's going to be accused of having a disproportionate response. Obviously, a leader like Benjamin Netanyahu understood that these were the conditions with which he was going to have to lead Israel through war. But he's also struggled to maintain a large amount of support in his own country. And we're seeing Jewish communities around the world having to deal with the consequences of that for the reasons we just talked about. Has Bibi done more harm than good in the way he has responded to October 7th?
So it's a really interesting question. And there is, absolutely no doubt that, you can make very legitimate criticisms about the way the war has been prosecuted. This whole, charge of genocide, which I think is particularly when it's done against the Jewish state. And remember, these people who have been claiming this were claiming this before the war even started, right? If you have to look, they were running around with signs on the streets of London 5 years ago, 10 years ago, claiming this. So, but let's not get into that broader debate about how, but although let's be clear, the rules of the game have been changed to make things fit Israel fit this circumstance. We had that on this recent one in terms of food and famine and all the rest of it, where the UN actually changed its measures to make them fit, because there is a activist base whose issue here is the existence of the state of Israel, and those people exist in the UN as they do in other international organizations. And that's their real issue, right? They just don't like the fact that the Jewish state exists at all. But there is no doubt also that there are legitimate criticisms people can make about the way the war is prosecuted. You see this in Israel at the moment, where I think polling shows a majority of Israelis want the war to end. They want a deal that brings the hostages home and ends the war. And actually, it's really interesting, quoting the former head of Shin Bet, Ami Elon, who in his interview in the Times makes a really interesting point, which is actually that the military campaign since October the 7th has probably been one of the greatest military successes of Israel ever, in that Hamas, have very definitely been depleted. You've had Hezbollah dealt with in Lebanon. Who'd have ever thought that we'd have attacks on Iran that have ended the way they have, which has shown that Iran has very little real capacity to strike as perhaps people expected, or even, if not capacity, but certainly the desire to get into this. And then obviously Syria, there's been a complete change. So in many ways, since October the 7th, the military campaign has been very successful. But whilst I think a lot of Israelis just want it bringing to an end now, and there are those who charge that Netanyahu has no interest in that because it's in his political interest, because the war ending probably means an election, and that could end up with a different form of government that doesn't involve him. So I think that there are some fair criticisms that can be made there. But again...
But it is interesting that you can have military success potentially at the cost of diplomatic success.
Yeah, there is no... Absolutely, because, Israel is, let's be honest about it, is diplomatically more isolated than it has been probably at any point in, certainly, since its existence, maybe. I don't know whether that's an over-egging the pudding a bit, but certainly we used to always say, those of us who worked in the Israel space, that, you'd have there'd always be a flare-up. The flare-up would come, the flare-up would go, and with it, a lot of kind of public attention would disappear as people go on to other things. I think there is a legacy with this one because of, one, how long the conflict's gone on, but also just the real hatchet job that's been done on Israel, but also the behavior of some ministers within the Israeli government and the things they have said. And yes, you can go around saying, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who often say things which offend the ears of moderates and all reasonable people in the West, are fringe figures who haven't really been able to have that much of an impact on the prosecution of the war. However, the fact is they are ministers. They've said it. Those things are a matter of record. And that has absolutely led to this icing of Israel diplomatically. And that is really, really dangerous. And, that's why you will have people in the diaspora community saying, well, Bibi doesn't really care about Jews overseas. Does he really care about how this is impacting on us? And that debate will continue to run. But, it would be better for this war to come to an end. It's probably reached its natural conclusion, right? Because can Israel achieve any more than it has already achieved in terms of its military goals? Probably not. But that said, I still don't think that any of that justifies just doing what these countries have done, which is going to do nothing to help move the peace process forward. It was almost like it's a kind of quite a selfish thing, really, of, because it's been a bit of a cause celeb on the left. It's who can race to be the person who, most recognizes Palestine, but it's not going to make no practical difference to Palestine, who have some very legitimate grievances about the way they are treated under the current arrangements. Absolutely they do. And I always used to, when we were in Israel as an MP, we would always go to Palestine, the Palestinian territories, and meet Palestinian leadership. We also enjoyed working with groups that were trying to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. We'd meet all of those, and you'd hear some genuinely quite legitimate criticisms, but none of that, and this won't affect any of that or help any of those people. So and it's also something I don't think even is going to politically help Keir Starmer. I mean, there was polling in the UK has come out since, one saying that 9 out of 10 Brits don't support the recognition at this time, and another, I think, was 2/3, something like that, don't, without conditions. It's the lack of conditions around the hostages and all the rest of it, I think, has offended a lot of people. And then the people who are really noisy and activist on this, it's not enough, because it won't be enough until you've fully disengaged, delegitimized, cut ties with Israel, cut diplomatic ties. So, I don't think it helps the peace process. I don't think it helps the various politicians who've done this politically, and I hope that wasn't their motivation domestically. I hope it was very much about genuine concern for peace, but it seems mad to me.
Well, now we have something else where Canada's offside with the U.S. position on this. So who knows what kind of impact that could have, again, on the trade relationship. Again, to your point, you'd like to believe that's not obviously going to be the ultimate motivator for why you make a decision of this kind. But,
But interestingly, Trump hasn't, while he's criticized and said it's, he wouldn't have done it, yada, 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 he hasn't, used it in a way I thought he might have done, which is to say, condition it and say, well, you don't get your trade deal unless you are on side with us on this. So it does lead me to, there's always this bit of a, not suspicion, because it's a fact sometimes, that often, countries, particularly on this issue, and I know this to be a case, since October the 7th, where the UK would change its language a little bit on from the US, which was done in lockstep with the US, as a way of diplomatically pressuring Israel and sending a message that, and it was all kind of coordinated. Now, I'm not suggesting this had that level of coordination, but there are also, I think there are clearly people within the US administration who are growing also impatient with the Israeli government to bring this conflict to an end. I mean, you heard Trump say, we need to end the war now. So perhaps, whilst of course they don't support it, and I'm not saying they did it in lockstep, but perhaps also it doesn't not help Donald Trump in his desire to want to bring the war to an end. So, we're out of step with the US, but the US administration doesn't appear to be saying there are consequences of that, which is quite telling in itself.
Well, if we can try and end on a semi-hopeful note, this is war. War is brutal. We all want war to end. We want the hostages released. We do want a negotiated, I think most people want a negotiated two-state solution. But the thing to be hopeful for is there are some templates, there are some examples of what this can look like. And the agreement that Israel has with the UAE, I think, is one that we can look to as to how the region can move on. And that is an agreement that talks about commerce, cultural exchanges between the two countries. It recognizes that there's a place for the state of Israel in that region. If we can, it's the hope that everyone has, but there's a model for what this relationship could look like.
I think there's a danger in even those relationships. And I think this is actually those Abraham Accord nations, seeing that Israel is losing its European and Western allies, is causing some of them to have internal discussions. I know this for a fact, around their relationship with Israel and whether or not they have they done the right thing? Because at a time when Israel's becoming isolated and diplomatically isolated from its biggest allies in Europe, who are some of the biggest promoters of the Abraham Accords, I do think there's a risk for Israel that it ends up in a position where it's losing Europe, it's losing even the American population. If you look at polling, will it also lose its reasons? So this is a really dangerous moment, which is, where, I hope that I'm proven wrong, and I hope this has a really great effect of moving the peace process on. I just don't see how it can possibly be helpful, pushing Israel into a corner and isolating it. And then doing all these silly things as well that you're seeing missions doing. Like, I don't know whether you saw, but like the Canadian mission in like Jerusalem, or the French mission in Jerusalem, had changed their address to like Jerusalem, Palestine, even though it was, I think for the French mission, it was actually in West Jerusalem, so a bit that definitely will be within the any negotiated settlement on borders with the state of Israel. East Jerusalem, of course, is still controversial, but you're seeing all these things and these niggling and stuff like that. It's like student politics, and you see it with some of this. This has been as I say, a cause célèbre. I just think, all that silliness is not going to help any of this. Although, as you've said, of course, I want there to be a peaceful state for the Arab population living in the Palestinian territories, living alongside Israel. We all want to see that. So maybe we'll be proven wrong and we will say this was a masterstroke. And in many ways, I hope I am proven wrong. Yeah. But
hey,
I just fear not.
I'll be the first to come on here and say, I was wrong. Yeah. And
there are voices including in Israel, that are saying maybe this is the way to move things on, isolate Hamas, isolate the more extreme elements in the Israeli parliament. So maybe they'll be proven right, and we should put that across as an opinion, so it's not just... yeah.
Well, as you can probably detect in our voices, it's something we do care about. We are trying to present a perspective here, and do want to do so in a respectful way that definitely accounts for the fact that there are a lot of differing views out there on this discussion. We will we'll bring some experts on this topic as well to join us in a future episode. We'll do an interview on this. But thanks so much for tuning in, everyone.